I almost didn't want to publish this video because I don't enjoy trashing on my beloved franchise, but with the Prince of Persia remake receiving an indefinite delay, it's probably time to return to the series and talk about the fourth game in the Sands of Time trilogy, Forgotten Sands. And right there is the problem. A bit of an oxymoron. The fourth game in a trilogy doesn't make sense. It's not just a red flag, it's a shining beacon of red on a red sun-setting horizon right above the Red Sea. Fourth game in a trilogy implies unplanned, not in the original vision of the series, sellout, milking a cash cow dead. By simple virtue of existing, Forgotten Sands is already on the back foot, and to foreshadow my general sentiments, it never really recovers from that position. The Sands of Time trilogy ended with Two Thrones in 2005. 5 years later, we get Forgotten Sands. Now, it's an expensive, properly voice-acted, high-budget spectacle that looks decent at times, but it's still come along 5 years later, for the sole purpose of marketing the 2010 Sands of Time film. Yeah, red flags are really in abundance here. As a brief asterisk, the Prince of Persia film actually isn't complete garbage. I remember watching it as a teenager with my mother and expecting it to be trash like most video game inspired movies, but actually finding a decent film there. Okay story and acting, lovely cinematography, like I'm not sure how well Jake Gyllenhaal playing an Iranian prince scores on the political correctness charts in 2020, but it's otherwise an easy, lightweight action romance flick, right? Give it a whirl if you're bored or zooted sometimes. Anyway, I'm not reviewing the film, unless there's demand for that, but we have to realize that this game's existence is essentially a glorified marketing campaign, which forces us to temper our expectations. That said, the game shouldn't be written off as a flop. It's no Warcraft Reforged. Plenty of people found an enjoyable time with the mixed bag of Forgotten Sand. As a general rule, I don't like prequels, with some exceptions. A prequel novel or film that comes out after a series, a full story, has run its course and ended, never really appeals to me. I take an absolutist position on this. The author should have said their piece in the main narrative arc. Any development that comes before we meet the protagonist is redundant. There's nothing new anybody can show us because we already saw the sum total of the character's development when the original story ran its course. It goes without saying that tweeting to expand your story's universe decades later is an even graver disappointment. Now, there are exceptions to this. Prequels to show off world building, different characters, totally removed arcs can be a lot of fun, but returning to a beloved character and series awkwardly trying to insert itself there it doesn't excite, doesn't inspire, doesn't do much for the franchise. But by golly, Forgotten Sands gives it a crack. But to the developer's credit, if you were the narrative lead here and Ubisoft had a gun to your head, demanding you fill some story into the udders of a cow that they can milk into some sweet cash, Forgotten Sands is definitely the sort of prequel game you would come up with. There are a juicy 7 years between our starry-eyed protagonist leaving Shahraman's conquest of India in the first game and arriving at the Island of Time in the second game, haggard and broken by the Dahaka's ceaseless pursuit. We also know very little of the prince's family life. Maybe he does have a brother. In terms of narrative realism, the pieces are here, but I would argue that some small changes could have helped cement the story, which I'll address towards the conclusion of the video. Now, there are things I like about the game, and if, dear viewer, Forgotten Sands was one of your favorites, I can see why. This game has some of the best puzzles since Sands of Time. Despite a rocky start, the mid to late game combat can actually be quite fun, totally innovated from the previous 3 games. And best of all, this game has some of my absolute favorite acrobatic set pieces of the entire franchise, and that's a hill I will die on. There is fun to be had here. You just have to wade through a half-assed narrative and some poor decisions and some questionable design choices to get there. So as usual for my videos on this delicious franchise, we're firstly going to talk about the innovations and variances, or lack thereof, Forgotten Sands has introduced. Following that, we're going to run through the narrative and have some fun talking about why most of these plot beats don't nail it quite as well as previous titles. I'll wrap up with some general thoughts, questions, lingering ideas, as well as small tweaks that I think could have made for a better game. Sound good? I bloody hope so, because I don't want to go on this journey all on my own. Okay, let's begin.
Always sad.
When talking about what's changed in Forgotten Sands, it's probably more helpful to start with what hasn't, what has conformed with our expectations from the franchise. Yes, the acrobatic, dexterous prince has returned with the familiar voice actor from the first few games who likes to sink into mournful soliloquies and act indignant whenever challenged by his female companion. We have action and flirtations with a female companion, and a plot-driving issue that slips wildly out of control until the fate of the world is at stake. But more than anything, the longer you spend with the title, the more it starts to feel like you're reliving the echoes of the first game in the series, with a few sprinkles of Warrior Within thrown in for light seasoning. We see little innovation at the storyboarding level, a journey into a new foreign land, albeit still Middle Eastern in aesthetic. Ancient corrupting sands are released that transforms the castle into a beautiful minefield of danger and intrigue, while a beast reminiscent of the Dahaka, but in no way matching in terror and awe, rampages after us. To top it off, we actually play through environments that are very strong allusions to scenarios from Sands of Time, whether these be astronomy set pieces that shift the environment or decadent bathhouses that revive the warm, alluring pleasure rooms that the prince first experienced in Aaaand. And occasionally, we come across scenes and design beats lifted directly from the first game. How you feel about these, and particularly that last one, are going to be really subjective. Are these cute throwbacks? Condemnable plagiarism and lazy design? Maybe you just find it a little obnoxious that the developers failed to innovate despite working on a new engine and having the benefit of years to reflect on the previous installments. For me, I just think it detracts from the identity of the game. There's not much to remember it for if its only selling point is a nostalgia trip down memory lane, because many people still own those games and can revisit them. And those things that have changed can sometimes leave me feeling a little unsettled. As a small example, the fact that the prince recovers health in a boring gamified way of collecting red orbs or his mana with blue orbs. At least the old mechanic of drinking water was unique, but for something more cutting and pervasive, the simple appearance of our prince. Sands of Time really sold the preppy, spoilt son aesthetic, while the following two games see the prince in his late 20s, looking leaner and unkempt, almost like he's been starved and fatigued after years of running and hiding from the Dahaka. But Forgotten Sands just has him looking weird. He looks too pretty in the face, his hair is kind of a juvenile mullet, and he's also too jagged and muscular in the torso. Just look at his frickin' arms, those triceps. Altogether it's jarring, discordant, and doesn't sit well with me. What about storytelling devices? Well, there's Razia, who shares the prince's thoughts later in the game, but for the most part the game is played straight. No third-person narrator, so no omniscient voices breaking the fourth wall if you die or pause the game. The prince does occasionally narrate in first person, giving voice to what he presently sees, but it's no more than airing dialogue that the prince is otherwise thinking.
By the time I reached the vaults, I understood why Malik had come here. He had placed his last hope in the army. His only other option was retreat, defeat.
Okay, so far Forgotten Sands isn't impressing, and if we look at enemies we fight, it doesn't get much better. Your bread and butter minions are the skeletons of King Solomon's army. These often come in overwhelming hordes and can be fun to chew into, but I think the designers needed more time to bolster these ranks with further models if the plan was to make this a wave-based game. Really, 7 or 8 models to add variety to the ranks could have done wonders, but as it stands, the prince often strikes against a clone army. Otherwise, we have the basis of a slasher game. You get some enemies that are brutes and need their guards broken, enemies that are more nimble and dexterous, a few heavy Tolkien-esque trolls that start out as mini-bosses until they are relegated to tough late-game enemies. There's a sore lack of range and projectile-based opponents, other than a few throwing fire bombs into the latter half of the game, but there is a fun inclusion of a resurrecting mage who, in a few fun moments, can create this sense of overwhelming odds as you try to cut through fodder enemies who keep resurfacing. All bound together, the intention is a compelling paradigm shift for the franchise. Lead game designer Thomas Simon explained that the intention was to force the player to employ the prince's crowd control powers, and that this justifies the lack of a blocking mechanic, since, because of the sheer number of enemies on screen, there is no way the prince can block and counter dozens of weapons. This means the prince must always be on the move and use the environment to limit the number of opponents he faces. In a remaster of the entire series, this is probably how the prince would fight. It makes sense to envision him as a glass cannon, agile and deadly, but I think there is a lack of enemy variety, and the minimal options that there are to fight with true agility, like making use of wall running or bouncing between enemies, or even stealth mechanics like in Two Thrones, means the developers only partially met this goal. And I would say the letdown here is the melee combat. It has undergone a less stellar overhaul. Dual wielding is gone and replaced with the one macho sword like in Sands of Time. You can hold down the trigger for an extra powerful attack, and even some of the hand-to-hand combat has been thrown in with kicks and shoulder charges to throw enemies off ledges, which would be decent except the prince is facing hordes of enemies, so a single unit finish feels like a wasted flourish. Blocking is just removed. Gone. So the prince fights as a glass cannon, which is actually one of the few choices I agree with. It's an awkward shake-up at first, but it's compatible with the slasher game Forgotten Sands is trying to be. Wide, powerful swings through hundreds of enemies makes for better pacing in the game, but it's just dead boring combat for the first hour until we unlock the magical enhancements. And that's actually where the combat becomes fun. I've said it in each episode, but I've never loved the combat in these games, and while the unlock tree is gimmicky, the range of devastating powers the prince unlocks is a useful and worthwhile innovation, as stealth was in Two Thrones. Seriously, it's that good. Killing enemies grants yellow experience orbs that float towards us, and level ups grant the option to maximize your health and mana pools, as well as 4 other abilities. Sorry, 3 viable abilities. Though it has many uses in RPGs, slow protective stone armor has no place in this franchise. But fire that follows in the prince's wake, ice that blasts through sword swings, wild tempests that blast the ground and disable enemies, these are cool, fun, easy to swap into, and there is a genuine acceleration to the devastating impact of these once they're maxed out. Yes, slow time and zipping around the arena are gone, but we've subbed them out for something much cooler. Michael McIntyre says it plainly, the prince still has the ability to rewind, but we also have powers that are more focused on controlling elements of nature. Overall, combat comes out as a plus for me, but the other branch of the franchise is the mechanical selling point that far outstripped combat in my opinion, the acrobatics, how the prince moves throughout the world. Some of it is still a little janky. It triggered me to no end that the prince's foot would clip through the empty air when he was beam walking around corners. But the prince's parkour is otherwise business as usual, with small amendments. Sliding down smooth surfaces becomes a bit of a puzzle, having to time jumps and wall runs as you control your inevitable descent as best you can. And it's a small gripe, but I just find it really strange that the prince can now leap to a wall and run vertically up the portion he lands on. Like, I get it, wall running was already a stretch, but talented freerunners can do it over short distances. But here, the prince is literally starting from a falling position, gravity pulling him to the earth, yet his feet still kick against the wall and he can scramble up a few meters. To me, it's the perfect example of the drawbacks of making mechanical improvements in a prequel, because the prince never did this in Warrior Within or Two Thrones. Somehow, he must have forgotten this life-saving technique in the intervening years, but we just treat it as a quirk of the game and move on. But the parkour has actually undergone an unsuspecting evolution, because we haven't yet spoken about the prince's other magic he unlocks in Forgotten Sands. See, while the sand powers are the series staple and need little explanation, it's actually not the mechanical focus of the game. Rather, the prince has access to a whole new branch of magic on top of his combat enhancements. Jinn magic. As the story progresses and the prince befriends Razia, our Jinn companion. She connects the prince with a whole new suite of magics that conveniently unlocks as the obstacles arise in the story. So we learn a dashing ability that lets us explode towards harpies and birds of prey hovering in the sky. We start to resummon the old ruins of the Jinn and restore Solomon's palace to its former glory as a new way to traverse the caverns below, and we learn to freeze water. Oh man, freezing water. Guys, this one simple addition is my favorite mechanic in the entire franchise. It's delicious, it's delightful. Suddenly, the developers have a way to make the acrobatics challenging. Now it's not until the last few levels that developers really go all out to test your reflexes, but some of those final set pieces make what can otherwise be a slog of a game worth it. Some of it's predictable. Vertical leaking drains become poles to jump between. Burst pipes become swinging bars. Sheets of water create frozen surfaces to run along. But as the stretches get longer and longer, as you often have to unfreeze the water so you can pass through it to the next handhold, and that small gimmick leads to a dozen of scenarios that I just adore. Dashing, freezing, leaping, unfreezing, freezing again and bouncing back. Never has our prince been so challenged. Altogether, we can see there's actually a bunch of mechanical meat here. You have the sand powers, which is limited to rewinding time, the 4 streams of combat enhancements, and then 3 forms of acrobatic related magic that help the prince navigate the world. It's a lot to take in, but to the developer's credit, it's never actually overwhelming. Playing on PC, I never felt confused or got my triggers mixed up. The combat magics were appropriate for combat, and the parkour magics were fluidly integrated into the world design. While it might not be to everyone's taste, I'd be rather surprised if anyone criticized the game for overwhelming the player, introducing these too fast, not providing ample explanation or tutorials, because frankly, I think the developers rolled out the prince's mechanical progression in a pretty thoughtful and sophisticated pattern. By the game's climax, and particularly in the set pieces against Ratash, you're dashing to birds, summoning bricks from the older world, and leaping from leaking spouts as you dash between refreezing sheets of foaming water, which phase from solid walls to harmless sprinkles in split seconds. It's wild, it's fast, it's fun, and I'll say it, it's probably the most difficult mechanical challenges the series has ever thrown out, while still feeling fair. Full credit to the developers here, they knocked it out of the park when it came to reimagining what's possible for a modern Prince of Persia title. And it's for this reason alone that, all the campiness of a prequel aside, I have to recommend Forgotten Sands to fans of the original trilogy who were always in it for the parkour. As a final comment, one of the disappointments to me was the amount of jank that made its way into the finished product. A glitch here and there is fun, in fact it's sometimes one of the highlights of a playthrough. But what is harder to tolerate is some of the cheap, tacky choices that linger like a soft, subtle, pungent stench that no amount of airing out alleviates. Again, I'm talking about how awkwardly the prince walks on beams. I'm referencing the fact that all enemies have the same animation. I'm talking about how often triggers won't execute to let you jump to the right target, or how there's no real game over screen, no sense of closure when the game finally wraps up. I'm specifically talking about the fake urgency the game tries to urge you on with. Fake because animations pop up but there's never any threat to them. Seriously, the game does this a lot. Take for example flurries of arrows that follow the prince in the early levels, which is outrageous because firstly, often the visual gimmick lands in front of us so there's no dread anyway, but also because, well, why not just make the threat real? If we linger too long, then have some arrows clip into us. The game doubles down on this in a breathtakingly stupid way later on as we flee from the gigantic demon Ratash running amok in the palace. Except he can never hurt the prince. He's scripted in advance to tear up the environment and nothing more. Suddenly, what could have been a wicked chance to try and rival the Dahaka chase scenes from Warrior Within becomes a pathetic, hollow experience that you can happily waltz through. The last thing to address is the impact of this game being a prequel, particularly since it's likely the last game most people played in order of release, and today is still probably the last game people would opt for in a new playthrough because of how modern it is compared to the rest of the series. It's what I've done with my reviews, after all. In a way, I think the damaging effect of a prequel is that it induces a butchered form of dramatic irony, a technique where the audience knows something but the characters in play don't. In Half-Blood Prince, we are suspicious of Severus Snape because of a prequel chapter showing him conspiring with the Death Eaters. In Game of Thrones, we know of Jaime and Cersei's incestuous relationship. In Othello, we know from the outset that Iago is a villain. In these examples, dramatic irony is useful because it reframes how the audience views the characters and the unfolding plot, adds an element of suspense, throws in some dread as the audience watches the hero fall into the villain's plans. But in Forgotten Sands, the insight we have into the game's trilogy siphons out all tension, because we know Ratash can't win, because there's 2 follow-up games, and so we know Malik must somehow fade into irrelevance because he's not waiting for his brother in Babylon come the 3rd game. And no matter what happens here, the prince's relationship with Razia won't amount to anything because she's never mentioned again. I think a prequel done like this leeches away a part of the game's soul. No tension, no stakes, just circling through rehashed ideas and a circus of overused cliches. This was a game to do away with the convention, do something wild, genre-breaking, have the prince lose his memory at the end of a series of traumatic events. To this day, I still don't know why they didn't just have the Dahaka interwoven into this game, since by the timeline it should have been hunting the prince by now. I simply have questions. And I think that's a good note to end this chapter on. Forgotten Sands has changed a lot, and with some innovations in acrobatics and combat, it was interesting as a kid and again now to see what Prince of Persia reimagined in 2010 looked like. But if you're a glutton for a good story like me, you're probably left a little bored with what's on offer here. And with that, it's time to do some narrative analysis. Discordant, jarring, confusion. These are the words I would use to describe Forgotten Sands' introduction. It's unsettling and strange, immediately blends together several scenes. It starts with a raindrop, donging you over the head with the fact that this game wants you to associate it with Sands of Time, which is fine, there's no shame in that. But it becomes clear this is a prologue of sorts, a flash forward as the prince gingerly steps through a blue-tinted, eerie fountain world, which fans of the first game will recognize, where an aggressive lady in the water yells at him. And then we cut back several days in time to the prince journeying through the desert, monologuing about his father, Shahraman, and his brother Malik, who rules the arid, nameless kingdom the game takes place in, and dumping a deluge of description that just bounces off with how dull and forced it is. Just, whoa-wee, talk about a whiplash of an introduction. But being charitable, sometimes the best way to start a story is with a brusque info dump. So what the prince tells us is that Malik rules the remains of what was once King Solomon's old empire, which holds some secret. Neighboring kingdoms regularly attack, and Malik, a fabled commander, repels these attacks often. And just like that, the prince arrives to see a mammoth invasion spliced with slow motion cuts of Malik wearing a blue and gold World of Warcraft-esque shoulder pauldrons, wreaks havoc on his enemies. In gorgeous detail, we see battlefield chaos that rivals any big budget films. The prince does some of his usual parkour, tower collapses, the prince rolls to safety, and then we're in. The game starts. We receive the usual crash course in combat and acrobatics as battle rages around us, harking back to Sands of Time and Two Thrones. Trebuchets let loose, warriors fight in the courtyard below. We get those cringe moments of arrows trailing behind us. And all in all, those opening minutes see the prince fight manageable groups of enemies and learn some basic parkour maneuvers, all with a few snarky, sarcastic comments thrown in. It's familiar and inoffensive, if not a little boring. At this point, there isn't really any plot drive. Comparatively, Sands of Time has the immediate goal of proving his honor, winning some prize in battle, while Warrior Within organically builds mystery as the prince is shipwrecked on the Island of Time. Here, the prince is kind of just vibing, walking about and seeing where the road takes him, knowing that he needs to speak with his brother to, well, I guess see how he's going to deal with the siege he's lost control of. Only by chance do we spy a few glimpses of Malik as he retreats into the castle, which is a very relaxed affair. I feel with more action set pieces, allied troops perishing, and an injection of drama, this could have made for an exciting introduction. But as it stands, it's all pretty casual, which isn't how we normally want an invasion scene to play out. Finally, the prince exchanges his first words with his brother, and as per usual, it's from a distance and they can't meet up just yet. I do want to say that I love Malik's design. He seems like a cool older brother, confident, well built, but also relaxed and charming with his open, decadent shirt. He looks exactly like any of your Arabic mate's older brother who works at the vitamin store and sells you discount protein powder. It's great. The design has struck the right balance to endear us towards him right from the start. Finally, the plot earns some urgency as Malik makes a hurried retreat, stating they can reunite in the vault. So the tutorial ratchets up a little bit, the enemies diversifying and coming in more complicated groups, while the level design familiarizes us with time circuits. The palace shifts into a more ruined layout, rubble, torn carpets, tainted luxury. Again, the prince's whining monologues are welcome, making it clear not much time has passed since his journey to India. He's still a little pretentious and snappy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Malik. Did I keep you waiting? I was tired from traveling all day, so I stopped in the baths to relax for a while. I had a nice hot meal, and now I'm ready to help you defend your kingdom.
Malik continues his retreat, and the prince, in hot pursuit, enters the treasure vaults, a visually interesting and vibrant location that is a welcome improvement from the palace exterior as we ride down carpets, cut down more invaders, and throw in some pole jumping for good measure. But this is a short stay, because finally the game hands us the lock-in event.
If it is in my power to save this kingdom, I will do it!
I'm not trying to question your leadership. You don't even know what you're releasing.
As many warriors as the grains of desert sand.
The cutscene does its job. Again, the game keeps hitting the right notes with the visuals. Solomon's vault is massive, feels sacrosanct, and I'm a big fan of that elephant head adorning the wall. Typically, Malik is eager to release the sands. I think our prince could have done more to dissuade him given his intimate knowledge on the foolishness of the topic, but family comes with its issues. I do like that Malik heeds his warning to not touch the sands, showing us that some brotherly trust does exist. Conveniently, 2 protective medallions are spat out from the one Malik inserted, and Solomon's sands, in no way a reskin of the sands of times, are released. And just in case it wasn't already clear this is a bad thing, the peaceable elephant's head falls away to show an evil, grinning demon? I suppose a unique element is that our new fodder enemy aren't humans turned into sand monsters, but rather Solomon's army itself, since rather than corrupting, these sands actually petrify the humans they touch. The swarm awakens, the princes are separated as they escape, and in the center of it all we see a big old demon release its war. Well, I suppose that's the tutorial done with, but not necessarily the game's introduction. No, it's only as the prince finds his way to a liquid, tranquil portal and steps inside that finally the game marries up with the prologue. The prince talking to Razia, a djinn and guardian of the waters who in ancient times helped seal the waters away. As our new female companion, she makes a bold introduction. Her design is memorable and the voice actor nails her immortal, otherworldly aesthetic, and I think there could have been something interesting here. A goddess the prince can't charm or woo like he does with Farah or Kylina. It would have been fun to see him rebuffed and out of his depth. Essentially, it's a shame that we have to wait until the final leg of the game for her to have a more active presence. Sadly, level designer director Michael McIntyre explains that the developers wanted to try something new here, keeping him alone since he's still partially mourning his relationship with Farah. I disagree with that choice. Regardless, Razia does provide the first thrust of active storytelling, telling the prince the corrupting sands may be reversed if the 2 halves of the medallion are reconnected, the one Malik holds. It's essentially the same impetus we had in those introductory levels, reconnecting with Malik, but now there's meaning behind it. The looming threat, a demon known as Ratash who has ambitions over the medallions. She also hands us our first piece of djinn magic, reversing time. By this point in the franchise needs little explanation. What I was hoping for in my playthrough was some explanation of the connection, if there was any, between the ethereal waterworld we entered in Sands of Time and the one the prince now finds himself in. Painted mural walls flank the central podium and surely hint at some expanded lore and universe, but nothing ever comes of it, which is so odd to me, since the aesthetic so heavily reflects that of the first game. More than anything, our stop with Razia hints at the general trajectory of the game. For the next several hours, we're going to see a cycle of traversing an environment, catching up with Malik, seeing something in the plot shift forward, followed by the debrief with this magical water lady. Upon returning to the palace, it's business as usual, after the quintessential introduction to the time mechanics, of course. While I do appreciate the prince's time reversal has some in-universe justification here, being our first taste of Jinn magic, it's hardly exciting since it was a given this was coming. Regardless, the prince forges resolutely on, now appreciating the full weight of the threat and having made his first ally. Typically, we are introduced to trap circuits, more complicated scenes of acrobatics that require you to use levers and switches to activate elements of the puzzle, as well as several more waves of sand monsters as the sky starts to darken. It's the usual content, fine enough, but the drab castle courtyard and barracks break rooms make for less than exciting set pieces. I guess a small element of characterization, empathy, is the prince expressing his sympathy for some of the petrified soldiers.
So this is what's happened to them. I hope they do not remember this when they wake.
Soon after, the prince catches Malik, and what we will soon witness is the eventual erosion of his sanity and common decency. But in this cutscene, we actually see the kind brother and person Malik is. His ambition is to close the palace gates and to stop the monsters roaming, spilling into the countryside, which, yeah, cool, makes sense, and he also accepts the prince's plan of reuniting the medallions without demanding proof. In fact, since he observes that the medallions also protect them from the petrification, he insists that they don't risk tossing the medallions across the balconies, but rather wait until they are together. He's a good person. I like him. Of course, it means the two must continue journeying alone until they can reunite their pieces, however. And did I just say I was getting bored of the scenery? Because the machine rooms of the palace defense systems was a fantastic change of pace. 20 solid minutes of acrobatics without the stiff combat that is several steps down from the first Drakengard game is a win from me. It's also a strong callback to Warrior Within as well as the defense system puzzle in Sands of Time. Now, that degree of callback is cute for now, but I would understand if someone were to find it lazy, grating design by the story's end, because there will be a hell of a lot more before we're through. Still, it's always a pleasure to listen to the prince's grumblings.
See, when I get into these situations, I end up ordered about by women. First Farah, now this.
The tension ramps up, or that's what we're meant to feel anyway, as we spot Ratash from a distance. He's horned, fiery, large, and booms in a foreign, ancient dialect, and I'm totally bored. Certainly the developers here are trying to mimic the sense of dread imposed by the Dahaka, but that was also layered in so effectively with chase scenes, the prince's genuine terror, and its intertwinement with the story. Here, Ratash is a cheap knockoff who summons an even cheaper lieutenant and then jumps away like the Hulk. It's hardly inspiring, and it's certainly the wrong way to go about characterizing the big bad villain for the final installment of the franchise. After more traps and zombies, we have a micro boss fight with Ratash's lackey. It clocks in as somewhat challenging, particularly with the swarming minions circling around and how weak the prince is without their strong abilities unlocked yet. Whatever the trick was for nailing this fight, I never really mastered, since the boss always ended up getting stun locked in a corner, and I wasn't going to pass up an easy win. Continuing the trek through the grim palace interior, the prince has another chat with his brother, who tasks us with closing a portcullis because he's dealt with a big sand army off-screen and yada yada. The thing is, as much as I like Malik, it's clear that the only interaction we're having with the man is in these really rushed cutscenes where he barks orders and commentary at us and runs off-screen to deal with another threat. And it's getting kind of boring, similar to our interactions with Farah in Two Thrones, because those cutscenes are no replacement for genuine gameplay bonding. Thankfully, it's matched up with the prince being given his first genuine puzzle, involving challenging levers and threading a clog around the rail to close the gate. The puzzle is decent. I mean, the footage shows that even the great unrivaled decadence that is my intellect was stumped for a few minutes, And as I fiddled about with the cogs, I think it's a good example of what Warrior Within and Two Thrones missed. An occasional puzzle that you can't just grind out by trying all the obvious avenues and pathways until something works, but rather it's a small brain teaser that requires you to think about the placement and the spacing. It is simple, but it gets a tick from me. And finally, we see the facade of Malik starting to crumble, that he's taking joy in his newfound power, that he'd prefer slaughter the sand monsters and take the experience points rather than deal with and eliminate Solomon's threat by uniting the medallion pieces in one fell swoop. The moment of rift is sown at the clear acknowledgement of distrust, where neither will hand over their medallion piece and risk losing their newfound source of power. Our second visit with Razi arrives, and the Jinn confirms that the older brother has fallen under the army's sway, that the prince failed and took too long in his mission. The prince, of course, was protected by Razia's magic. Very convenient. And very quickly we come to the true complication, that if Malik cannot be reasoned with, then the prince must eliminate him, step up, be a man, take his kingdom, etc., etc. It's a little boring, but forgivable because Razia leaves the prince with the power to freeze water, and suddenly, oh man, the game just got so much funner. The next set piece is the prisons, again repeating a drab environment as the prince hastens to find Malik and makes some mournful dialogues. A few acrobatic set pieces later and the prince enters the sewers, a fitting environment to master the newfound water power as a staple in his magical tool belt. Otherwise, the only notable moment from this segment of the game is the introduction of the final staple enemy our prince will have to deal with in this castle, the Resurrection Summoner. Again, probably my favourite in terms of complicating the combat, but the fact that the fights are mostly the same from here on out, with the occasional mini-boss thrown in, doesn't reflect well on action sequences. Really, it isn't until we return to the ever-familiar palace baths that I'm finally excited about a new location. The bathhouses ooze dedication from the designers. It's painted beautifully, the level design is clever and engaging, and maybe it's my imagination, but even the music feels inquisitive and fun. Sadly, there's no Farah to keep the prince company, and I think any fans of the franchise would have loved him to make a cheeky reference here. But as it is, the prince soldiers on until he very randomly bumps into Malik. Of course, Malik is becoming obnoxious, violent, suspicious, and a rather dull anti-villain. Ignoring the underwhelming dialogue and the random door shutting as he walks out, I do like the small flair of Malik's suspicion as he witnesses the prince's jinn magic. It does make sense that he would be envious and distrusting of a new source of power he doesn't understand. But again, not much is happening in the story as the prince is just plodding along, again looking for his brother, searching and traveling aimlessly. And aimless is the word that sticks out, because it's not long until Ratash appears in all his cliché monstrous glory to destroy the palace in a convenient route for us. But does this make sense to anyone? The prince's observation is so bizarre, it's jarring to me. Ratash is shouting gibberish. How the hell does the prince infer that he's being thought of as King Solomon? The writers clearly have an idea that they want to put forward, but it's not delivered well. And what's worse is it actually just gave me an idea. Wouldn't the story have been so much more interesting if, in the first half of the game, Ratash did think the prince was King Solomon and actually acted servile, fawning, and doing his utmost to help us here, such as destroying enemies for us, purposely molding the environment to help us travel along, and just otherwise assisting the prince? The prince would be confused, Malik could witness this and have genuine distrust in the prince, and there would be a compelling sense of mystery, and it would be unique, never done in any of the previous games. Look, it's just a random thought that I had as I was reviewing the footage and thinking about how dead boring this part of the game was, but I think it's such a shame that we can review and reflect on so many set pieces here and kind of just imagine more interesting ways to approach the story. The next location is once again very beautiful, impressive in its scale as it reimagines the Astronomy Tower set piece from Sands of Time. It's, I don't know, shocking and godly in its size. You can imagine there being some truth to it predicting the future. But also, bathhouse followed by astronomy tower, I think those who criticize the game as a Sands of Time clone don't do so unjustly. But look, it does well enough for me. It's a bit of fun pushing the levers, watching the pathway slowly unfold, opening platforms and frozen water spouts, and the prince has some pretty fun dialogue. After it's all said and done, it's a little hard to imagine there wasn't some easier way to cross the cavernous room, but that is just typical for the franchise. I will say, the build up to the midpoint boss fight isn't half bad. We just had a massive set piece adventure, the prince then has a few waves of combat, followed by a grimly lit trap circuit, and then an ominous walk up to the throne room. It genuinely does capture some of the induced dread of a Dark Souls game. What's more, even though that it's on a time-looped animation, catching glimpses of Malik and Ratash fighting in the backdrop as the prince navigates his way there is pretty cool. Now, the fight itself is, well, look, you can really get your Dark Souls on, right? You roll beneath swings, stick between the legs, and back off when a powerful stomp is charged. Nothing groundbreaking, but you also have to remember that boss fights have come pretty dang far in the past decade, so for back then, it wasn't too bad. More than anything, I kind of think of how easily the prince disarms Ratash is a disservice to the story, since it really strips away any of the ominous sentiment we have held towards the big bad demon. I guess somewhat predictably, after beating Ratash, Malik absorbs the demon itself, shattering his medallion and becoming the living avatar of that evil creature. Okay, so again, this is serviceable. It could have been stronger if Malik's character was handled better, but I do have to question the choice of having us defeat the main villain halfway through the story, only to then have Ratash surface again later because, well, we've beaten that challenge, the stakes aren't there. That said, the follow-up conversation with Razia is handled well. She's not snobby or condescending, and that line, Malik didn't kill Ratash, Ratash killed Malik, is actually pretty good. It hints to there being some scheming to the main villain, that they planned this, that this was all considered. She does have good dialogue, and Razia does give the game's best sense of purpose since we've been playing, which is now to find Rakem, the lost city of the Jinn, and see what help we can find there. So a sense of purpose is helpful, giving the prince and players something to work towards. The new ability we unlocked is passable. It's hard to feel strong about a dash ability that serves as effectively a long jump, but the game does strike some clever use from the power. In particular, the next environment consists of garden terraces and leaking aqueducts that makes for a lot of fun. With flowing water and plenty of empty space, the prince's toolkit is really tested, and again I'm struck by how difficult and well designed some of these acrobatic circuits are, comfortably surpassing courses we've seen in the previous 3 games. The hunt for Malik continues, and from a distance we see his corruption is obvious to the point of becoming obnoxious. Slow motion shots of cutting down enemies, letting out a war cry, and slapping on his badass but now kind of villainous mask from the game's introduction. The corruption has run its course, and a few minutes later he evolves into a fully fledged demon, and it's really rubbed home when we see him Hulk jump away. Surely he's beyond redemption now. The second boss fight of the game is mostly a rehash of the first, with an emphasis on dodging the area of effect attacks by ducking behind stone monoliths in that circle arena. Story-wise, it does seem a little jarring that the prince is heartbroken and conflicted, but is also content to run headlong into battle and hack apart his brother. But the visuals actually sell it quite well. The desert backdrop, the demonic aesthetic, and reviving enemies add a little bit of variety, and Ratash's health bar is a bit beefier. That said, when it's all said and done, and the fight comes to an early close, I'm left with one thought. We've beaten Ratash twice now, and the threat feels pretty superficial knowing that the prince can take him down. So the thought of fighting him again a third time is so underwhelming that I'm not looking forward to the game's climax. But super conveniently, the prince is dropped off at the secret entrance to the super long lost city of the Jinn. How's that for a fortunate stroke of fate? Truly though, making our way to the city of Rakem is one of the game's highlights. It oozes atmosphere, entering from the dusty drawbridge into a quivering catacomb, tight corridors full of traps that feel very unwelcoming, until finally entering an outdoor puzzle arena. Really, these puzzles aren't super difficult, but they are genuinely thought-provoking and require some foresight and planning and understanding. So many games mistake puzzles with pulling levers and watching a bunch of things happen as you follow a linear path, something I criticize Jedi Fallen Order for as much as I love the game. But I like the ones that are done here in Forgotten Sands, and what's more, it feels appropriate to the universe. You can imagine that this is how the Jinn unlock their entrance to the city, since only they will control the water element, and only they can unlock the entrance to the city.
Who builds these things?
The prince is right. It's extravagant and ridiculous, but sliding down the tunnel into the home of the Jinn is such a memorable set piece where, long after you've forgotten about the game's contrived story and lack of character development, you'll probably remember moments like this, sliding hundreds of meters and running along circular walls as the stone drops away, making it there with the skin of your teeth. This is the art and essence of Prince of Persia. Another catch up with Razia, and here we see the prince still resist the loss of his brother. Again, Razia presents herself well. She apologizes for the dangers the prince faced in reaching her home, admits that she herself is nervous about trusting him, and finally gives him his third magical upgrade, the ability to restore the ruins of the past, adding another layer of complexity to the burgeoning toolkit. Once again, I'm struck by how much more powerful the prince's relationship would have been with Malik with a few tweaks. For example, imagine a small rewrite of the story where Malik and the prince only have one half of the medallion to share, and the other is taken up by one of Ratash's lieutenants and they must go hunt it down. So the first hour or two has Malik as an in-game model like Farah in the first game, journeying with us but slowly growing more sinister and arrogant as he becomes drunk on Solomon's power. Then, once they recaptured the medallion and Malik stalks off, you'd have a few hours of gameplay with the prince alone and sulking before finally picking up Razia as a companion. The game's trajectory would be like a sandwich, journey with Malik, then alone, then with Razia. As it is, we've just had the prince alone for an entire game, and only now had a fun companion injected, a bit too late in my opinion. The old city of Rakem is gorgeous, I can't deny it. It's grand and dominating and strikes a spiritual, commanding presence. Having Razia appear also is kind of touching, the first time she joins the prince out in the real world. But this moment has also come so late in the game. Here, she drops a few solid minutes of lore and nuance to the world and her plight as the last of the Jinn, but that would have served well hours ago. Even showing us a spooky mural of Ratash misses the mark because we've already fought and beaten him twice, so any sense of tension and dread that this long-forgotten mural is meant to evoke is wasted. Razia continues to give the backstory of her past as they find Rakem's throne room, and the prince complements this with anecdotes of his own.
I spent many hours here learning statecraft. That was so long ago.
Most of my days in the throne room I was trying to sneak away. Malik was the responsible one. How will I explain to our father what happened here?
You will tell the truth. Ratash killed your brother and tried to destroy this kingdom. And you saved it.
Again, I'm beating a dead horse here, but it's all really good dialogue, the sort of environment that I like the prince the most in, regretful, thoughtful, and learning about himself as he bonds with another. But this has all come so freaking late in the story. Either way, parkouring through Rakem makes for some of the funnest acrobatics in the game, and if you haven't been paying attention, it's easy to miss the unexplainable shift to an alpine snow environment that makes no real sense but adds to the mysticism of the world. And finally, after more puzzles, Zerg fights, and overwhelming odds, the prince finally reaches the mystical blade he has come all this way for. And then Razia becomes one with the sword. Yeah, she just lets go of her earthly tether and gets up inside that sword, meaning that for the rest of the game, her voice travels with the prince as he goes down to hunt Malik, which again is frustrating because I swear I won't mention this again, but the banter and dialogue with the prince is so good, the story has just lost so much momentum because it took so long to get to this point. So the driving force now is to climb out of Rakem. Always a good Prince of Persia last leg of a story has a strong climbing upward scene. Here it's staggered and slow, so gradual you might not notice the world losing its blue tint and shimmers of magic as the prince leaves snowy Rakem and returns to Solomon's castle and the whipping desert sands. And the dialogue really does add stuffing to what was earlier a lifeless narrative. We see Razia drive the prince, encourage him on his quest.
We must find Malik.
I do not think that will be difficult. Even now, I can feel the strength of the army.
Then we'd better hurry.
There is fun banter about him using her to clobber enemies.
Not expected to go so easily.
You know, it's rather unsettling to have one's sword comment on a battle.
It is also rather unsettling to be the sword in a battle.
Good point.
And even sillier comments that make callbacks to the fact that the prince blamed her for his sliding descent into Rakem.
This is the king's tower. It will lead you back to the palace.
I don't suppose you have something as simple as a staircase.
Oh, of course. But you didn't seem to like the last staircase I sent you to.
Very fun.
And even some tender moments between them as their journey comes to a close.
The tower marks the border of my kingdom. We are in your palace now.
Are you alright?
Of course.
If it is in my power, we'll make sure you return home.
Thank you.
The final hours of the linear game is so frantic and pretty fun. By this stage, you should have unlocked most of your combat powers, so you can have fun in how you take down the swarms of sand monsters. And the developers go all out with some of those final acrobatic set pieces. Like, man, it's so precise and fiddly, needing to freeze to hit the panel, then unfreeze as you fly through the running water. I don't know. If you think I'm overselling it, tell me. But I think this right here, these last 5 minutes, is some of the best Prince of Persia ever made. It lacks the emotional weight of Sands of Time, it lacks the personality of Warrior Within, but in terms of raw mechanics, I think this goes unmatched. But it's here, at the 99% mark of the story, that something feels off. At a snapshot, the narrative appears serviceable. We have an antagonist in Ratash, whose ambitions of proliferating the corrupting sands runs contrary to the prince's goal of reversing them, which creates escalating conflict. There is a steadily blooming relationship with Razia, which fills in the dead time. And while yes, these are all executed pretty poorly, there is one crucial failing that stands out above the rest. Stakes. What is at stake in the prince's journey? Seriously, think about it right here. The action is climaxing, the prince is on the back foot, but why should we care? What is our investment? What is the outcome we should be afraid of if Ratash succeeds? What does the prince have to lose if everything goes wrong? And there's no answer to this except there are no stakes. There is no reason to care. The prince can't die because this is a prequel. Ratash can't succeed. Malik, Razia, and King Solomon's kingdom can't carry over to future games. The prince can't even retain his new sword or the fancy power-ups. Essentially, the game wants the player to have strong feelings about these parts of the story, but there's a dissonance because the player already knows all these things are impermanent. And the writing simply isn't strong enough to make us really care about Malik, the people, even Razia that much, in the isolated 10 hours of this story. Regardless of how fun some of the set pieces are, and trust me, some of them are really good, there's a hollowness that lingers, a faint disappointment that haunted me at least as I wrapped up the game, because I no longer had interest in the overarching narrative, and that sentiment lingered all throughout the final boss fight. So we find Ratash, the remnants of Malik, wandering in the sandstorm he's created, bloated like a cancer, incapable of speech, nothing worth redeeming. The first half of the sequence sees the prince navigate the sandstorm. It's flashy, employs sincere overuse of shaky cam, and comes off as a little obnoxious, but there's no denying that it's the biggest set piece the franchise has ever attempted. Non-stop movement, bouncing between shattered walls, making arenas from torn off plazas and battlements, and sliding down the shards of the palace. It does everything to sell the prince as a dexterous ninja caught up in a supernatural sandnado. Obviously, this all serves to dump us face to face with Ratash, on a platform, him looming above, big and menacing, like it's some kind of Yoshi's Island throwback. His moveset is okay, it's varied and keeps you rolling around the altar, but the opportunities to strike back appear infrequently and drag out the fight. What sticks out is that in every other Prince of Persia climax, there's dialogue, some clash of desires and wants, but from coming face to face with this demon-possessed brother and finally thrusting the blade into his chest, nothing happens. The game just kind of finishes. It peters out, and wraps up with an absolute whimper. There's a 60-second cutscene of the prince waking up, Malik complaining that he was a prisoner to the sands and telling the prince that he's the better man and will be a great king. And then Malik dies and the camera pans away. Game over. Honestly, it feels like either the budget or timeline was stretched to breaking point with this kind of wrap-up, especially since Razia's fate, the only other character of mild relevance, and the fallout of post-Malik's death is crammed into a post-credit scene. Essentially, Razia ended her life in destroying Ratash, the sword, a cold, empty vessel once more. That's kind of a shame. She seemed cool, had flair and personality, and she kind of just gets deleted off screen. I feel like this could have had better impact with her saying farewell or making a clearer sacrifice. Speaking of the blade, the prince says the line, "I could not bear to keep her with me," so clearly he was affected, upset, feeling loss. So why brush this moment aside, the only moment of genuine emotion this story could possibly have? It just reeks of amateur writing or depleted resources. And anyway, then the prince goes home and tells his dad about what happened. Just what a wet fart of an ending. Nothing. No ambition, no attempt at a climax or moment of catharsis, no mystery. Just the fight ends, fuck it, sweep the rest into the bin. There were so many options here. Play it straight and have Razia make a touching sacrifice when the boss was on a slither of health. Or strike at the heartstrings and make us play a final acrobatic set piece, mournful and somber as we return to Rakem and deliver Razia's sword. Nothing that overstays its welcome, just 2 minutes of the prince flipping around and rambling some dialogue. Or, what I was expecting, have black storm clouds appear on the horizon, building and collapsing, rushing forward as the Dahaka arrives, searching for the prince, actually giving Forgotten Sands some merit and slotting into neatly as a connecting dot between games 1 and 2. But no, nothing, none of this, nothing, just absolutely nothing. If you can't tell, I really tried to be charitable throughout Forgotten Sands' narrative. But once it's all laid bare, all the pieces are there for us to inspect, I think we can all agree that it was a pretty deflated bundle of missed opportunities and under-delivered promises. I wish that wasn't the case, but I don't think there's anything left to say. I'm not sure how I managed to talk for so long about Forgotten Sands. I suppose most of the time was spent whinging about changes and complaining about misuse of character, but still, I don't know if the game deserves this kind of video. I'll never play Forgotten Sands again. Never. I can appreciate some of the fantastic acrobatic set pieces for what they are, and I even enjoy some of the small moments with Razia, but Forgotten Sands ultimately doesn't sell the Prince of Persia experience I want, which is a story about the prince's growth as a young man, reflected in the people he meets throughout his quest. So a game that is effectively a remastered Sands of Time, minus Farah and all the expert character development, doesn't make for a fulfilling 6 to 8 hours. Which again is a shame. While Prince of Persia's design is pretty daggy, so much of the world is gorgeous. The baths, the journey into Rakem, and those temples beneath the earth are some of the prettiest environments the franchise has offered. But beauty isn't enough. Sometimes fun combat isn't enough. And certainly a shoehorned brother we know from minute 1 has a death flag hanging over him just doesn't cut it. There's no adventure, no tension, no charm, and I'll leave my ramblings at that. What I will say is, to the small percentage of people who ever get this far, thank you for listening to me and agreeing or disagreeing or absent-mindedly going about your day as I spoke. It's taken me 9 months to get this video out for a bunch of reasons, but I would always come back and chip away at the project because of people like you. People who sit through the entire hour or so of content, the people who might leave a comment about something I missed or why they hate something I said. That engagement is fun, and it's still mind-boggling to me that someone might have just spent the previous hour of their precious free time listening to me talk about a game from an old franchise, and frankly, the worst game of that franchise. So, comment if you have anything to say, I'll probably reply. Otherwise, thank you once again for watching. Have a good one.